Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This is a sort of an instant response video which is going to be a discussion because Sean the Book Maniac, in his 10 strange bookish facts about me tag that he did, in his 10th prompt he said that he's the only person other than perhaps me on BookTube that he's encountered who's completely disinterested in reading retelling of myths in literature, in modern contemporary literature. And that's absolutely true. I am. I also, like Sean, haven't really discovered anyone else in BookTube who feels like that. And I just wanted to sort of discuss why that is in my case. I don't want to speak for Sean. Sean speaks very eloquently in his own right on that subject on his tag video, and I'll post the link to it. But I just wanted to explain why, in my case, I'm completely uninterested in reading any kind of retelling of a myth. I have to say that I'm actually pretty hostile to myth itself anyway. So I'm going to start with that, and then I'm going to talk more specifically about why I won't read retelling of myths. So the problem I have with myth is, I think, there was a time and a place for it. Culturally, when we were tribal and clannish and nomadic possibly, or the sort of the great Icelandic sagas when they all gathered in the sort of communal hall, because that was an age pre-science. The supernatural was very much paramount, of unexplained things. We didn't know what cause and effect of lightning was and things like that, and thunder. So we gave them supernatural or mythic explanations. And, most cultures have a founding myth, and on an intellectual level, in a sort of anthropological or social and cultural sense, I am interested in reading that. So I've read the Greek myths, the Old Testament myths, sorry for anyone of religious persuasion, but to me they are myths. Some Mesoamerican myths, including the rather wonderful one that the earth is basically formed on the back of a turtle, it's carried by a turtle, which I think is a rather wonderful notion. And Norse myths, some of the English folklore stuff, the strange creatures in the woods of boggarts and elves and leprechauns and fairies and all this sort of stuff. So on a sort of intellectual plane, I can appreciate these. It's very interesting trying to follow the transmission of how one sort of culture will colonise another and take parts of their myth and develop and take it on and build it themselves. So the whole sort of transmission between sort of Sumerian, Hittite, Jewish, ancient Greek, there's lots of things you can find that they have in common, and they've sort of borrowed and repurposed, from each other. That Tiamat becomes Leviathan, or all those sorts of stuff. The Hittites had, before the ancient Greeks, they had the myth of, a father who devoured his children, and in order to save the next child, the mother goddess, wife of that being, gave him a stone to bite down on, thinking it was a child, and all that sort of, and that became the Kronos, the myth of Kronos. But it was in Hittite, mythology. Just the Greeks found it useful to suit their purposes. So I'm interested in a sort of transmission and a sort of historical, cultural. But we no longer live in an age where we don't understand cause and effect to the extent those people did. I'm not saying we know all the answers, far from it. But we don't need to give supernatural explanations, and I don't see why we still need things like founding myths, such as the Old Testament. The world was created in 7 days, of which the seventh day God rested, all that sort of stuff. So I actually see myth as holding us back. So I'm pretty hostile to myth in and of itself. The Icelandic sagas, with everyone gathered in the great hall of the village, the myths, the storytelling, which is one of the first literatures, let's not forget, that served a purpose of explaining things supernaturally and foundation myths, but it's also being a way of bonding the clan together. But everyone has to share that myth. Everyone has to believe in it. There's no variation allowed. There's no different interpretations allowed, which is another thing I find with myths in that context as being sort of pernicious. That it reinforces the class divide, the hierarchies within those clans and whatever. And the Icelandic myths, they may go on to give these sort of incredible imaginative stories of giants and Beowulf and Ragnarok and all of that, but also it establishes who has power within the clan and they cannot be challenged. So it's used for social control. So that's another reason why I'm against myth. And we just have to look at the history of religion in the world as to how that is used. That you have a priest caste that was sort of pretty much self-elected by being able to read, by being literate and being the only interpreters of the holy word, because no one else can read them. So this is why I say, to me, myth is pernicious. And I have no interest in modern day creating of new myths, be they retelling of old myths or just some other spurious, set of myths by which, the world is claimed to be explained by. Okay, so that's why I'm hostile to myth itself. Now, you can say that Jung, in his sort of theory of the collective unconsciousness, suggests that it's no coincidence that human beings from whatever culture, whatever background, seem to return to the same archetypes of figures: the joker, the trickster, the hero, all these sorts of things. And in Jung's mind, that's sort of proof that these archetypes and these myths are shared communally, no matter what the cultural difference is. And I have several problems with that. First of all, Jung was a raging anti-Semite, which I think disqualifies him from being treated with any kind of moral seriousness. Second of all, I don't think the fact that different cultures and different parts of the world have similar stories, and this we're not talking about the transmission between Sumerian, Hittite and Jewish, because they were geographically local to each other. So we're not talking about that mode of transit. The fact that there are certain stories in Australasia might share something in common with those in Russia, where there was presumably minimal exchange and contact in the early years of man. But I don't think that proves the collective unconscious at all, except as a lack of imagination in humankind, by which I mean, I think the fact that we've only come up with these certain archetypes or certain, same types of stories is a reflection of the relationship of our perception systems, eyes and visual cortex and all of that, and the fact we operate in 3 dimensions, not 4 or not 2 or not 6, with our linguistic and symbolic system that we've erected. That is the collective communal unconscious, not the fact the myths. The myths are the output of quite a rigid, limited system of linguistics, of syntax, and particularly of symbolic systems. So I reject the notion that this is proof that we all share the same, symbols, types of mythic stories, because somehow it's innate to us. It isn't. It's an output of our language and our symbolic systems and our perceptive apparatus. And this is where I'm going to get more specific about why I'm not interested in retelling of myths. The notion of an archetype that Jung posits, trickster, hero, all this sort of thing, archetypes are simplified human beings. As it goes back to that notion, as I said, that everyone has to, in prehistory, everyone has to follow and accept it exactly as they are told. They cannot reinterpret or have their own subjective view. And that is antithetical to literature. Literature is about, yes, it's about the universal, but it's also about the individual psyche, the individual consciousness. So one person's hero in one novel is not the same type necessarily of a hero, in someone else's novel. They can be 2 completely different ends of the spectrum. So the notion of archetype is reductive. So it's important for social cohesion. It's important for everyone to believe in that archetype for whatever symbolic place it holds within that culture. But it's antithetical to literature, because literature is much richer than archetypes. Archetypes are reductive characters, whereas literature is concerned with much more nuanced, expansive character. So that's the first reason that I'm not interested in mythic retellings, because literature is much more expansive than archetypes, which is what myth offers. The second reason is I simply don't see what added value retellings bring to myths at all, because if they're going to honour the myth, they're not going to change it much. Therefore, you may as well go back and read the original. And if they go way off message and get all very sort of quite surreal on it, you're probably going to lose touch with the origin myth itself. So the example I would give for this is less of a myth, is Shakespeare's plays. You know, Shakespeare was writing in the 17th century or whenever he was, and you know, a lot of his stories were pinched from earlier stories. So in a way, he's sort of recycling other people's myths, which again shows the very limited number of stories that the collective human imagination has come up with. But let's, even leaving that aside, I cannot see what the point of redoing Coriolanus or Macbeth, you know, from their sort of, you know, Coriolanus was set in the Roman Empire times, Macbeth was set in the sort of, you know, the Dark Ages in Scotland. That's why there's all that supernatural stuff with the three witches, which I think are very powerful. And the reason that they are reinterpreted and told in modern settings is because the artistic directors and the theatre owners take the view that they won't speak to modern audiences because we're so removed from Roman times and Coriolanus. We're so removed from the dark supernatural era of you know, 10th century Scotland or whatever it was. Therefore, in order to make it, you know, understandable to modern audiences and modern sensibilities, you know, they'll cast it, they'll set it in, you know, Stalin's Politburo. So Macbeth would be redone as sort of Stalin's Politburo. There's the, you know, the lust for power and you know, killing your, you know, your rivals in order to. Sorry about that interruption. That wasn't any wrath or ire of some supernatural god because I denied the myth of which his origin was established. That was because there wasn't enough electrical charge in the cell of the battery. Anyway, as I was saying about sort of Shakespeare adaptations, so if you set Macbeth in the Russian Politburo because you want to talk about the power struggle, instead of Macbeth and Duncan and all the rest of them, it's the people who were vying for power after Stalin, so Beria and Khrushchev and all the rest of them. But then what sense does the witches have in that? So either you lose or you downplay that, which is an essential part of Shakespeare's original play, or somehow you work it into the sort of the Politburo of Stalin, which of course Stalin's regime was anti anything to do with religion. It was, you know, sort of based on dialectical materialism of Marx, you know, so it makes no sense whatsoever. And this is what I feel about updating any modern myth and setting it in the 20th century or the 21st century. You wrench it from its context, and either it's reductive or you lose meaning, you certainly lose some of the context of it. So that's why I say I cannot see what added value you get from sort of modern updating of myths. What are you bringing to the party? What new insight are you giving? You're trying to maybe make it relevant to our modern age, but if these myths truly resonate, if they're truly applied to the universality of human experience, they shouldn't need updating. You know, you go and see a Greek classic play performed as close as we can get to the original style of Greek tragic drama. If it is truly universal, it should translate to a modern day audience. You know, we still read Chaucer and can understand him. We still see Shakespeare's plays in a, you know, Jacobean English, and we can understand them. Yeah, they're a bit tougher than stuff in our own tongues, modern idiom. But is that the only reason for updating classics, just to render the language more modern? So again, I cannot see what the added value of updating classics, and I see no need to read them, because if the original classic or myth is truly resonant, I can't see how the modern could do anything but approach it, mimic it, match it, but not improve it, not add to it. And just as the last thing I'm going to say on this is Camilla Shamsi's Home Fire, which won the Women's Prize this year. So, you know, I had no real intention of reading it. but my wife was reading it for her book club, so I borrowed her copy just because it was knocking around the house. And I'd heard how it's about the a modern updating of the Antigone myth or classic drama set in modern day Britain with sort of around terrorism. And I read the book, and 4/5 of the way in, you finally get to the Antigone bit. So the preceding 4/5, there's very little inkling of the Antigone stuff. And then you get the modern day parallel with the Antigone myth, which is about sort of burying a family member who has transgressed, having the right to bury them in your country. But if he's transgressed, the state say, no, he can't be buried in, he's renounced our state, our civilization, he can't be buried within its soil. And then the book moves on to other stuff. So, what is the point of touching briefly for, 15% of the book on the Antigone myth, referring to it? What does it add? I don't get it. I just don't see what the point is. And as Sean says, you have to be familiar with these myths in order to know what they're touchstoning. Having said all this, I will make an admission. When Canongate used to do their myth series, which was commissioning modern authors to write their versions of myths, I discovered several new great authors. I discovered Michel Faber, Victor Pelevin, and Dubravka Ugresic, who I'd never heard of any of those writers before. And it was only through the Canongate Myth series that I went on to read others of their works. But I have to say, favourite authors, all they are of mine, I think their myth series of the Canongate series is the weakest of their books. And Jeanette Winterson, who's always a perennial favourite of mine, she also did one in the myth series. And again, in her personal canon, it's way down near the bottom. So there you have it. That's my brief rejoinder as to why I side with Sean in our lonely two-person camp on BookTube, as to why I'm completely uninterested in reading updated myths. Okay, thanks. Till next time.